welcome to our next episode of CyberTangent. Today we have with us Jerry Caponera leading us in a discussion about cyber risk. Welcome, Jerry.
Thanks, Landon. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you. So Jerry is Nehemiah Security's VP of Cyber Risk Strategy. And again, he'll be leading us in our conversation today. A bit about Jerry. Jerry leads our efforts to quantify cyber risk in financial terms. Prior to Nehemiah, Jerry founded Pivot Point Risk Analytics, which focused on value at risk modeling and simulations. Jerry's got a broad background in cybersecurity, having worked for incident response, malware analysis, and services companies. And you may recognize Jerry from his time speaking at a number of conferences worldwide. Jerry has a bunch of fancy degrees that basically suggest that he's a smart guy, and he hails from places like Buffalo and University of Pennsylvania and the University of Massachusetts. So again, welcome, Jerry. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Landon. Pleasure to be on CyberTangent.
So the title of this, 10 questions on cyber risk. There's no guarantees that I'm not going to add a couple questions, but let's pretend there's going to be 10 questions, right? This concept of cyber risk, Forrester just added a category that surrounds this area. Gartner's talking a lot about cyber risk. It's a big space that's coming into the limelight right now as companies grapple with it. If you had to use, let's say, 10 words to describe cyber risk, how would you do that?
I'd have to have a dictionary to make sure I found words that mean lots of different things. I think the words that pop to my mind for cyber risk really start with business and finance. Been in cybersecurity for a long time, and most of the conversations we have are very technical. Cyber risk, though, is a business conversation, and it needs to be talked of or thought of in that way. So definitely business, definitely finance, and really getting that foundation correct. I think the other thing, got a couple of words that pop to my mind are board level, because I'm seeing more and more boards and executives get involved in this. I'd argue confusion and unclear vision permeate cyber risk. If you ask, I think every report I've read talks about CEOs saying that the number one risk they face is due to cybersecurity, and yet most aren't prepared and don't have a plan for it. And so that kind of leads me to my last part of it would be, these are the most dangerous and critical risks businesses face today. We've seen the big impacts of breaches. We saw the beginnings of these with Target. We're seeing more and more big ones with Experian. We're seeing more and more small companies go out of business. Cyber risks can do real damage. They're dangerous and critical to your business. And so if I had to kind of wrap it all together, it would be, the business, the finance, confusion, board level, and really they're dangerous risks that we need to be dealing with.
Okay, good. Thank you. You are in and out of a lot of organizations, talking with security leaders, I know. How would you characterize your standard organization today and how they manage cyber risk? What does that look like?
So it's interesting. The way I'll answer that is the way I think people should be managing cyber risk is like a business risk. Cyber risk presents a financial impact to an organization, and every financial risk or impact you have has to be dealt with in either a level of acceptance, transference, or mitigation. Those are the three things you can do with any financial risk you have. And so most of the organizations I talk to today have some level of financial mitigation in place. They'll have cyber insurance policy. They'll obviously be spending a lot of money on cybersecurity, but most organizations are not doing this in a cohesive, unified manner. A good friend of mine is a CISO for a very large, well-known organization. And I'll never forget when I first started working with him, I said, "What is your cyber insurance policy? How does that relate to you?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. I've never spoken to the risk person here. Let's go find them." And so we actually helped him talk to, for the first time, his risk counterparts, which is not surprising based on what I've seen. And that's important for security and managing risk because the insurance policies themselves come with a set of standards and things that have to be done for the organization to actually be able to leverage that if necessary. So it's the biggest thing I see when talking to organizations is a lack of unification of strategy across those three things: acceptance, transference, and mitigation. They're just not aligned in a clear, cohesive way.
Right. So I heard that. I also heard the gap in communication between the important stakeholders. Yeah, that seems to align with what I've seen when I read about.
It is. I mean, everything you read about, CEOs are saying they don't understand what their exposure is. And on the flip side of it, though, if we put our security hats on for a minute, if you think about it, cybersecurity as a business really came about in its full-blown nature in the late, mid 90s when the internet boomed. And so it's still a young industry.
Yeah.
We don't have the mature processes or really governance things in place to be able for larger organizations to understand that. And so this disconnect where cyber grew up out of this very, very technical thing and only a handful of people could understand it. Well, guess what? That's how people still report cyber risk today. And so if I were to walk into my CEO's office and start talking about things like mean time to resolve and dwell times, I'm pretty sure I'd have him asleep in about 30 seconds. Yet if I were to walk into his office and say, hey, here, the risk of a ransomware attack on our business means you're going to lose 25% of your customers in the next 6 months, he's going to pull what little hair he has left out of his head out.
And no sleeping. No
sleeping. But that's not a scare tactic. That's just taking the same information I have and conveying it in a way that they understand. Our CEO in particular, or most, would understand.
Okay, that's great. And thank you for outlining the real challenges. And yet, we know these people. We work with them, our security leader friends within these organizations. They are hard workers, and they are good at what they do, and they're passionate, and they're capable. I'm interested in learning a little bit more about what the core struggle is here, right? I mean, and forgive me, it's an overarching question. It's almost unfair, but if you even think about it from a people struggle or a process struggle or a technology struggle or those three, what's at the core of the struggle for companies to communicate cyber risk today?
It's funny. There's a lot of ways to answer that question. I've been married for a long time, and my wife always tells me that our problems are either lack of communication or me. So I think most of them, me, yes, okay, me, not you. You're not my problem. And it's funny because I think actually most of the problems that we have in our world today is lack of communications. And I don't mean we don't talk. I don't mean we don't have mechanisms or channels to communicate. I mean, we talk past each other. We literally talk past each other. And so when you walk into an organization and they're struggling with cyber risk, the reason I got into this space, the reason I'm so passionate about this space is because it breaks down that communications barrier. An example I gave you a few minutes ago where we talked about, if I were to walk into my CEO and tell him a risk in terms of technical terms or customers he could not acquire if a breach hit us, is a way to take that conversation and ensure that our communications are done in a way that the person receiving them understands, right?
Yeah.
And so when you think about cyber risk and what the struggle is, you have a team of security professionals who've been in a lot of SOCs, and I've worked with a lot of analysts, and they're overwhelmed, and they've got too many things going on. They deal with alerts and events and all day long. They deal with the business going, you're just in my way. You're in my way. I don't understand why you're here. What do you mean I can't just bring any device in off the street and connect to the main database server? What's the problem with that? You're slowing me down. And that's their complaint. And on the security side, you have the guys going, but you don't understand, right? Every time you click the same phishing email I tell you, which says, don't click this link, and you click it, you infect these machines, data gets out, and we lose money. They're saying the same thing, right? People really do say the same thing. I don't know any security organization that I've ever talked to that isn't in the business of making their business more secure, protecting their revenue, or protecting the mission that they're after. The biggest struggle they have is they haven't figured out how to walk into their business peers' office and really get them to understand that security is there to help them, not to be a burden. And vice versa, the business can't walk into security and go, hey, thanks, I understand what you're doing. To give you a great example, one of the first people I ever worked with was in that exact situation. And when we finished working with him, we had given him some dollar numbers around cyber risk. He said two things I'll never forget. This was a couple of years ago now. He said, well, first of all, I walked into my boss's office when we finished the presentation. He said, this is the first time in 3 years I actually understand what you're doing. First, and I can call him up today and he'll validate that as the quote. He said that, and then he said, well, I understand what you're doing. I'm going to give you more budget because I don't want to have to deal with the things you're telling me about. Which for him was just an eye-opening experience that when you communicate something in the right way, it actually does work. So the struggle is one of the age-old struggles of communications. And we have to communicate in ways that communication is not about speaking. It's about listening and making sure your message is understood. I can't make people do anything. My joke is I can lead a horse to water, but I can't make them drink. Right? I can drown and put his head in the water, but I can't make them drink. So don't try and make them drink. Just make sure you lead them the water in a way that they understand.
Okay, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I do want to test you on something just to make sure I have it clear. I'm going to search your wife back in here, right?
I'm in trouble, by the way, for all you people on the line here. Communications
is a struggle. And one other phrase that you said was really powerful is it's equally as important what's said as how it's received and how it's received. Mm-hmm. Is it helpful? Here's the question. Is it helpful for an emotionally mature, organizationally mature CISO to think of this as any challenges that I run into are either a communications breakdown or me? Is that helpful for somebody sitting in that seat?
I tend to think that way personally, and I do think that would be very helpful. For the CISO who struggles with communicating to their executives, you have a lot of data. Security organizations aren't lacking in the data that they generate, the metrics that they have. Instead of thinking about how would I present the data that I have, what I always tell people, and always recommend to anybody is say what you want to say to yourself, and then ask yourself just one question. If you were sitting on the other side of the table, how would they receive it? Right? If you walked in as a CISO and said, hey, we processed 38% more alerts this week. We deployed a new patching system that gets us down from 14 days to 7 days, and we're more efficient on our IR plan. If I didn't know security, I wouldn't know what that means. So I actually do think it's extremely important for everybody, and especially the CISOs, to be introspective and say, am I communicating this in a way that makes sense? You can think of it like a pitcher and catcher in baseball, right? If you're the pitcher, the reality is the pitcher does not throw what the pitcher wants to throw. The pitcher and the catcher communicate. And the catcher says to the pitcher, I'm expecting you to throw this here. If the pitcher throws the ball somewhere else, guess what? We either have a home run, hits batsman, or the catcher's chasing the ball behind the backstop. Sure. That's not a good thing. CISOs need to think of that as well, too. They need to think about how do I put myself into the seat of who I'm communicating with, and how do they want to hear what I'm telling them? Not what, how. What are their drivers? If you're talking to your sales leader, well, talk to him about how security can make his customer experience better, faster, smoother, and more secure. If he's talking to legal, well, guess what? I'm actually going to make your life easier and let you work on more cool legal stuff because I'm going to keep you out of the data breach problem.
Okay.
If you're talking to IT, well, guess what? We're putting in place an anti-ransomware program so that your data backup thing that you're doing, it's awesome, and it'll fit right into our strategy. Right? Think about how you're communicating and to whom in order to make sure your message gets across.
Next question. So if you were to walk into an organization today, what would be the three things, let's say, that you would look at in order to assess that organization's cyber risk management maturity?
So it's interesting. We've spent a lot of time, it sounds so simple, right? Communications. It's a very simple one-word answer to a lot of problems, but it is the driving force between a lot of challenges we have in an organization. And so if I had to look in and come up with a couple of things, one of them would be, how do they report risk today? How and to whom? I've seen a lot of organizations, one of the challenges in cyber is, where does the CISO report? Common question, people always ask, everybody's got their own opinion. So if one of the things I would look at is, how is risk reported today and to whom? Because the reality is, risk is an enterprise level risk. It is something that is on par with your strategic plans to open up new shops, or dealing with competitors, or legal challenges, or tax burdens when the laws change. It's on that par. How's it reported and who's looking at it? That's one of the biggest questions I would like to know. I'd love to be able to assess and see how the security leader is aligned with their peers. Right? Great question. I mean, how often does the security leader sit down?
Within the company?
Peers within the company. How often does the security leader sit down with the person who runs each division? Do they have a monthly meeting with the division heads or the presidents of the different companies that they support? How integrated are they from a business and security perspective? Right. That lends to the sophistication or arguably maturity of the organization. Right. And the third thing is actually a little bit different. It's culture. It's the culture of security. Look, security is probably the hardest risk one of the harder risks to manage, because it's always changing. It's hard. It's never the same thing day after day. I think, and it's funny because you read the statistics on phishing training, anti-phishing training, and the best companies get, 85 to 90-ish% good at it, which means 5, 10, 15% of people click on these things continually. So it's not because you don't have smart people. It's not because you don't have good people. It's just they will. And so the question is, what kind of culture do you have? Is that something that you work to train them to get better on? Is that something you tell them, hey, look, if you get a suspicious email, call me, here's the help desk, being proactive? Is there kind of company-wide awareness of the risks and the exposures, right? Is there that culture that says, security is as ingrained to our business as email or as something we do. Think about it, let it be conscious, because that'll also help reduce the risk, which is obviously one of the signs of a more sophisticated or mature organization.
So for those keeping notes at home, communicating how and to whom, alignment with peers, and culture of security. Those are three things you'd look at.
Those are three things I'd look at.
Let me pick on one of those for a moment. Culture.
Culture.
One of the hardest ones.
One of the hardest ones.
What is one of the biggest obstacles that gets in the way that you've seen of building a strong culture of security within an organization?
Culture is, to your point, one of the hardest things to change. And I think there's probably a couple of reasons. First of all, it's very hard to define an ROI for culture, right? Like, not just a security problem, it's an everything problem. So culture is one of those things that has to be top-down driven. And then you can't set up a culture that's not adaptable and changeable, especially when it comes to cyber, right? Cyber has to be defined, process-driven, and obviously for mature organizations, well-reported. But in the same time, you have to balance speed and agility. And so when you talk about a culture of security, you have to have that maturity. You have to have good, clear definitions, but you also have to have speed and agility in as well, too.
Yeah, good.
That it's a constant pull between those two camps that I think is the biggest challenge.
One of the things I think about, you mentioned the top-down driven. I've also heard the top-down driven and bottom-up enforced.
Yeah.
One of the campaigns that I find to be aligned with that really well is the Department of Homeland Security, see something, say something, right? 4 words.
Right.
And that was an attempt to change the culture of we have to bottom up enforce this thing called physical security at airports and public places. It's kind of a neat way to think about it. It has to be bottom up enforce, see something, say something, change the culture.
You want another kind of way to look at this, you in a way want to crowdsource security within your organization as well, too. If you and I individually get an email that looks suspicious, well, we should report it. If you and I get the similar suspicious email, just as an example, that starts to say something. It starts to create patterns out of volume. It's the Waze concept I'm a Waze junkie because, we live in DC, and if you wake up and drive, there's traffic. It doesn't matter day or night. It doesn't matter. If you wake up, there's traffic. 24/7, love the area. But Waze has been a great concept because it crowdsources kind of that traffic reporting. And it's, from a cyber perspective, it's similar. We need that bottom up. We need multiple people to be able to tell us, hey, here's kind of what I'm seeing coming, and here's what we're going to do about it.
I'm prepared. So I've made my way through 5 questions, halfway about. I'm prepared to start diving into some real meat.
Okay.
But first, are you ready to have some fun?
Of course.
All right. So Jerry and I cooked up this idea of having a joke contest. And the quick version of the format is we're going to go back and forth, alternating between questions. And the joke giver will get 1 point if they can make the other person laugh or giggle, or if they're trying to hold it in, snort, right? 1 point. We've got 3 jokes to share each. We have not seen each other's jokes. I will give you the honors, and you can go first with your first joke.
Okay, here's my first joke. How many programmers does it take to change a light bulb? None. It's a hardware problem.
All right, there you go. Why, Jerry, why was the network administrator late to work?
I don't know.
Well, there was lots of traffic congestion and even a collision. Everything was backed up. It was a hard drive.
Okay, that's pretty good. Why did the developer go broke? Because he used up all his cash. Does it count if I laugh at my joke?
Why did the hacker organize a fundraiser marathon with his buddies?
No idea.
Of course, because he wanted to make a bunch of money from people who ransomware.
I like that. I like that one. All right. So, we live in the world that the internet drives a lot of what we do. Do you know why they call it hypertext?
No, why?
Because they had too much Java.
Okay, so my last one. 2 bytes meet. The first byte asks, "Are you ill?" What did the second byte reply?
I don't know.
No, just feeling a bit off.
That's pretty good. I like that.
Geek fun. All right, you ready to get back to serious business?
As long as we have another joke round at the end, that was kind of fun.
This is a tough question. How can organizations think about their cybersecurity risk in a structured, intelligent way?
That's a great question. I think the way I like to tell people what I like to tell people in organizations that when they're thinking about cyber risk, you need to think about it from what the impact is and where does it happen. Cyber risk is a fun thing in that we talk about it, and the reason we're having this conversation, the reason you're seeing so many boards talk about it, is because there's a financial exposure to this. It's a business-driven thing. There are dollars focused around this. And yet, if you ask the next logical question, which is, all right, I see that it costs me money, but how or where? It becomes a very technical thing. And so when I talk to people, and again, I like to keep things really, really simple because you communicate better in simple terms. There's 3 things I always like to tell people that from structuring a cyber risk program or really understanding it, you want to think about what's at risk to the business. What systems or applications power that? Because everything we do that has a cyber risk is associated with an IT system or a business application of some kind. Everything from email to a big ERP system to a CRM to my phone, for example. The actual attacker, however, is going to go after the devices themselves, right? So there's this traceable or this taxonomy which says my business leverages a certain number of systems which are made up of endpoints, technologies, phones, laptops, routers, switches, all the geeky stuff that sits in that data center and has blinky lights on it, looks really cool, right? That's the universal picture of cyber risk, those 3 things. And so if you want to think about cyber risk, those are the 3 ways you need to think about it, because first of all, your business does come first, right? This is top-down driven. It's all about the Benjamins per se. It's dollars first. The second thing is, I'd argue, you as an organization can't protect everything. The whole concept of we're going to build bigger moats and bigger walls, that went out when that Game of Thrones, that big dragon came in and took down the wall, and the White Walkers came over. That bigger walls won't help you. Same concept in cyber. And the third thing is, it's about where these things actually realize, what's actually going to get attacked. So we need to start changing our philosophy that says we're not going to necessarily work on building bigger walls. We're going to find out what matters most first, which is why that second layer, where we start talking about, tell me about the applications that most power the business. Let's figure out ways to protect the endpoints and dollars associated with them. It's kind of changing the paradigm a little bit, but it's structuring cyber risk in a way that matters most to the business while realizing that the business risk is tied to an actual technical risk, such as my phone or your laptop or something along those lines.
Okay, so if I followed you, the structure you're laying out includes a business layer that is what's impacting the top line or the bottom line. Let me oversimplify it that way, right?
Sure.
Then there's an application layer of the structure that you're proposing, which includes how the business is run, how the top line and the bottom line are actually driven. And then finally, there's an attack
surface.
So there's an attack layer that
attack
is
surface, yeah.
What's vulnerable, what's likely, what's possible. And is the idea to manage all these concurrently to figure out what, I guess how are companies, the ones who are doing this, who are on the vanguard of doing this, how are they doing this well?
What they've done is the ones who are on the vanguard have identified what are the critical systems to the business, and they prioritize those first. We have a customer here who told me, he said, one of the things he wanted to be able to do was he and his IT peer in the IT organization, have sometimes a contentious relationship because security will ask him to go do 100 different things. Well, here's the 100 top vulnerabilities I need to attach or priorities I need to deal with. And IT pushes back and says, we don't have the time or bandwidth to get this done in the time you need. And so what we're actually helping him do is say, look, of the 100, there's really only 7. Here's the priority list. These 7 have to be done, not because some technology said the score is high, but because the impact to this critical business system, which powers the revenue that we generate as a company, is impacted most by them. And so he helped us really figure out the visualization for our own product to be able to do that. And because what he said real clearly, he said, I want to be able to build a traceable view that shows my IT staff why I'm asking them to do what they're doing and helping them prioritize, not based on any technology, but based on the business. So that's really what this is after, is how do you prioritize and then communicate in a way so that you can get the right things done in the right period of time? Because again, we don't have enough time. There's not enough time or people to do everything. And so we have to figure out how to prioritize correctly.
The word sounds beautiful. You just bridged for us the business to the security team, to the IT team. The words sound beautiful. It sure sounds like a lot of work. It sounds like you just pulled every bit of intelligence from every corner of the organization and started with your magic wand. Let's step back for just a moment. Help me understand, even in your story, if you want to use that, if you want to continue that example, who within an organization needs to be involved with an effort like that? Well, who are the major players who need to be involved in order to make that happen?
So in that 3-layered approach, that 3-layer cake, because I like cake, that 3-layer approach, you're dealing with, at a minimum, the business. I always like to make sure that the CEO is engaged or aware of an initiative like this. Now, they're not going to be your detail person. They're going to be driving and making sure that they're getting what they need out of this. So definitely keep them in the loop. But then you're going to want to talk to your business heads. Who are the business leads for the divisions or organizations that matter?
Line of business owners,
however you're structured. You're going to want to obviously have legal and risk involved from a consolatory perspective, right? You can think of this almost like I don't want to make this a very consultancy thing, because while it sounds complicated, we've done a very good job of automating a lot of this. But in terms of who's responsible, informed, consented, or accountable for something, an old RACI model, RACI, is a great way to think of this. You're going to want to keep legal and your risk folks involved. And then it's about IT and security. So you start with the business first to make sure they're involved and informed. You take that to the IT organization and then keep security involved. And between those 3 groups, you loop in legal or risk when you need them. That's really who should be driving this. Now, you're also right in that it sounds like it's tremendously challenging to start with. And
I was just about to say, tell me who's not involved then.
Well, so the reality is that's where it kind of gets interesting. I mean, we walk into companies and they'll tell us that the biggest thing that powers their business might be their e-commerce, right? They're an e-commerce provider, or if they're in financial services, it's their trading system or their customer relationship management. Depending on what the risk is, you don't need to involve everybody, right? We want to kind of avoid the whole groupthink mentality where I have to get everybody in and on board, but you do have to identify the right people. So, for example, if I'm dealing with my point of sale system for e-commerce or a trading platform for finance, I don't necessarily need to bring HR in on every conversation. You don't need to bring legal and risk in as well, too. You need to get started and rolling. You need to get the right people to give you the right information and then to go and then start communicating that afterwards. Now, what's fun about this is the other question I always get is, it sounds like taking forever and you're going to come into my organization and hang out. And again, I've seen enough companies and enough organizations to make some pretty blanket statements. I think most companies have enough data to last 2 lifetimes. I don't know. I've never spoken to anybody who said they don't have enough data.
Data starved.
I've never heard a data starved organization. I've seen many organizations fill out TPS reports till the cows came home. Come in on Saturday to help them as well too. The reality is, again, this is what we're describing here is less. It's not a product. It's not a technology. It's a different way of thinking. It's a different approach to solving the problem. And how this approach works for us and why this works is what we've realized is that 3 levels of taxonomy, that business, the IT, and the security is how both the attack is realized and data needs to be captured. So you can very quickly and easily gather what you need and then start communicating with legal and risk. I'm a big believer in communicating, again, but to the right people as well too. So it's not there is no black and white answer of you always have to call 7 people, 2 people, or 4 people. This is definitely a conversation starter. I will tell you that though.
I'm going to guess that you would say this is more of a journey than a destination. To me, that's the way.
That's a leading question.
That would be what somebody would say if they went through the psychology program as opposed to the electrical engineering program like you and I did.
That's right.
So while that's unsatisfying to us engineers, it is a journey. I get it. But how does a company know they're heading in the right direction or in an okay place where they are, or they've got this much more work left to do? How is a company supposed to give themselves the pat on the back or we got to get going?
That's a great question. And it's a different way of thinking. The way I kind of like to view this is, remember a few years ago, there was the Human Genome Project got started?
Sure.
Right? And its goal was to be able to map the genome so we can start to figure out what's going on. Yeah. Great effort, great initiative.
At the NIH, right in our backyard.
Right in our backyard. Well, guess what? I mean, what cybersecurity needs, what cyber risk needs is really a cyber risk genome project as well, too. Because what we're actually doing in the organization is fundamentally mapping what is your risk and then all the characteristics about it. So in order to get started, in order to really begin this initiative, in order to know you're on the right path, have to be heading down towards the right destination to make sure you're on the right journey. And that's and if you think about it in kind of I want to map the genome for cyber risk, that at least starts to frame that conversation to say, am I gathering good data? Am I gathering the right data? And am I making decisions with what I have today? One of the fundamental mistakes that people make is they think they need to have the genome fully figured out and have everything completed down to the nth level of detail. That might be correct for the human genome, to be able to figure out some of the diseases that they're trying to solve. For cyber risk, we're more predicting the future, and so we don't have to be there yet. You can do this with what you have today and use industry data to start to fill in some of the blank areas as well too. So when people tell me we talk about this all the time, it being a destination, and the destination is via this journey. What I would suggest is think of it like you're trying to map the cyber risk genome for your organization, and you're looking to get started and build that out. And where you don't have everything you need, you fill in the blanks. And then over time, all you're doing is you're removing some of the stuff you filled in with more and more accurate data. Now, I will tell you that eventually you'll stop. You'll have enough. You'll have enough information. There's a law of diminishing returns. But if you're on that path, if you're going, I want to map what risk is to my organization, and I view this as a journey, as you said, being able to kind of put it in context of I want to map this and get enough information is really critical.
Cyber Genome Project. That's an interesting concept. I like it. Okay, so we've bounced around and dug into some areas in a broad range of areas. We've used words like emotional maturity and organizational maturity. We've asked this security leader who's managing cyber risk to pull data from every corner of the organization, to stakeholder with all the leaders around the organization. It's a big ask. It's a big journey. You've done a good job of laying the foundation for why it's important. Last question. Talk to me about who leads this thing. What is the face of the next gen cyber risk leader? And what skills do they need to have, and how is it different than the typical security leader of today's organization?
So when I first started in the cyber risk space, I went to an event at Dodger Stadium in LA. Okay. It was very cool. Got to see Dodger Stadium, right? Classic. I'm a New York fan, so I was a little disappointed they moved, but way before my time. But it was kind of neat. Sat around a table with a bunch of CISOs, and I listened to them talk about reporting to the board. Probably half of them said, we need to change how we report to the board. Just kind of a generic conversation. One gentleman got up and started talking. He said, I could never see why my board would want to report in terms of dollars and cents. I give them all the technical metrics they want. And it was funny for me to sit back and listen to his peers tell him he was wrong. A couple of his peers stood up and told him he was wrong. Only 2 or 3 of them, though, out of 10. And that actually fits the metrics that I saw, right? The CISOs, most CISOs today have very technical backgrounds. They grew up in a technical space, right? They grew up as the best security person or the best network person. Only maybe the stats I've heard and from what people I've talked to, maybe 25% are business-driven leaders. So what the future holds, if cyber is ever to truly get out of its purely technical realm, is for cybersecurity professionals to be business people first. Best way I ever heard this said was at an ISACA conference, where one of the leaders of the ISACA said, I don't call myself a cybersecurity professional anymore. I call myself a business person who knows cybersecurity. Right? Okay. The next gen security leaders are going to be able to speak the language of the business. They're going to understand dollars and cents. They're going to understand revenue projections and risk from a business perspective. They're going to understand how to really manage and communicate in dollars and cents. They might not be the smartest security person in the world. They might have a team that backs them up. They're going to be business people. That's where cyber has to go, because we spend a ton of money on cyber today, and it's a huge financial risk. I think the numbers I read are like cybercrime could be like $6 trillion in a couple of years, and we're spending $90 billion this year. These are not small numbers, right? But these are business numbers. And so that's why I firmly believe the security leader of the future will be a business person who knows enough about security rather than being the best or smartest security person in the room.
Well, thank you, Jerry. And I know this is something that you're very passionate about. It's near and dear to your heart. And if I believe you and have seen you work over the past years, I suspect that we'll see more progress here thanks to the work that you and others are doing. So Thanks for being with us for a great conversation here on CyberTangent. Thanks,
My
Jerry.
pleasure. Thanks, Landon.